seen those glasses? I think so. Okay. Hi. I also need to fill you in on what we decided to do about the humanities, National Endowment for the Humanities.
I know.
Because they're not interested in chapters 3 and 4. They're only interested in chapters 1 and 2. What's that? Oh, my phone is way over there and not a distraction. It's silenced. It's on vibrate. I got my quarters in me. My meter's running, so. Nice to see you too.
Good morning,
Oh my goodness, imagine seeing you here.
I know, I try not to travel too far.
Good morning, everyone. Okay, let's do it again. Good morning, everyone. Hi. Thank you so much for joining us for this session, The Power of Place. I'm Marjorie Sims, and I'm Managing Director at Ascend at the Aspen Institute, and I have the privilege of serving as Managing Director at Ascend at the Aspen Institute because it truly is a phenomenal program. And the people that I get to interact with on a regular basis, I call them the coalition of the willing. The people that know that systems and policies need to change on behalf of all families in our society. So before we get started, just a little bit more about Ascend at the Aspen Institute. We were founded by Ann Mosley. Is Ann in the room? She's on her way. So Ann Mosley is also power in many places. So just know that, this program at the Aspen Institute was created by someone who truly is a social entrepreneur. No is not in her lexicon. So over the last 10 years, we have focused our work very specifically on making certain that all families are moving towards economic mobility. That means all families, every single family. And we do that primarily by taking a two-generation approach. This means providing services and supports to the entire family. So think about it. This concept is inherent in indigenous communities here in the US and around the globe. If a family has an emergency, the community doesn't just say, oh, we'll support the children or the teen or the adult. They support the entire family. So this concept, called a two-generation or a whole family approach, is reflected across the country. We have a national fellowship program started a decade ago with 20 visionary entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, and now we have close to 100 fellows across the country, and you'll be able to hear from 2 of them this morning. We also have a national network of nonprofits. See, that network was coming in today. They're like, we're going to be seen too. But this national network is comprised of nonprofit organizations and associations. Again, all of them are focused on how do you make certain that all families have economic mobility. We're close to 470 now in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and now we have a partner in Ireland as well as Rwanda. So this concept of serving families holistically really is taking root. We started our work with a small cohort of people that really believed in making change, and now we're considered a field and a movement. So I invite you to learn a lot more about our work. You can visit our website, ascend.aspeninstitute.org, and learn a lot more about all of our programs and the people that fuel this work. But know that the work is centered on families, primarily. We want to lift up their voices. as well as making certain that at the community level, the state level, and the federal level, our programs and policies are changing to support whole families. There's decades of research that support this strategy, and what we need to do is change our current policies and systems to make certain that we take this whole family approach. And I'm reminded, that a two-generation approach, not only is it inherent in indigenous communities, and we're trying to make change across the country and now around the globe, but this saying that all things that are new are not good, but all things that are good are not new. So we're trying to root all of our work, lift up leaders across the country that are doing this, and move forward with the Coalition of the Willing. So before I introduce the panel, this session is called The Power of Place. Just take a moment to think about a place that you consider powerful. And then also think about why you think that place is powerful. You got it in your mind? So some of you probably thought of institutions. Some of you may have thought about a business, or maybe a sector, or maybe a home, a neighborhood, or a community. Our session today is really about looking across the country and lifting up those people in communities and those strategies that are really making change, that aren't getting the visibility at the national level often. But we believe in big ideas, but we also believe in proven solutions that are grounded in community voice and strategy, and they need the visibility and the voice. And so that's what we're about this morning. Everybody ready? Yeah. Awesome. So let me introduce our panelist. And my furthest left is Dr. Wendy Ellis, an amazing Ascend Fellow who has spent a decade looking at communities and communities of resilience. She has built, a long, history and strategy working in over 5 metropolitan communities. 20 now. So, see, that probably happened in the last week because this is how Wendy works. She is truly a visionary and is going to showcase for you some examples of the work that she's doing. And we'll learn a little bit more about her specific work. But next Ascend Fellow, I'm so pleased that we have on this panel Huerta-Migus. I knew I was going to mess that up because I never really studied Spanish, but Lara is an amazing leader, and she is now currently the Deputy Director of the Office of Museum Services. She was appointed to this position about a year ago now, and she comes to this work with a long, established, legacy, working, to support children's museums here and around the globe. So we'll learn a little bit more about their work, but again, this session, Power of Place, is to really lift up those solutions, and we'll have an opportunity for Q&A, but let's get started with the conversation. So, Wendy, I want to start with you. Can you first share a little bit more about the real day-to-day work that you're doing in communities and how you're supporting communities, and especially what changes have you seen over the last 2+ years as we've navigated a global health and economic pandemic? So Wendy, take it away.
Oh, that's such an easy question. Global pandemic. So, what's most important in the work is really when we consider power of place is not just thinking about, as Marjorie said, the power of the institutions, but the power of the people. and oftentimes removing the power of the institutions so that people can exercise their own power, particularly power of community. So that is what's really at the center of our work at the Center for Community Resilience at George Washington University, where we work with place-based coalitions across multiple sectors to address what we've called the pair of ACEs. So that's adverse childhood experiences in the context, and the second part is so important, in the context of adverse community environments. So it's the starting from the output of understanding we're not going to program our way out of this. And there also has to be an intentionality on systems and policies, because when you begin to do the dissection and doing the analysis of our systems and our policies, you see oftentimes those policies were written and implemented intentionally to create the reliable and predictable disparities that we see by place, by race, by income, by education. And I want to put those last four qualifiers in here on here, because one of the words that you did not use, and I'm not, but I want to make sure that gets into the conversation, is about equity. So we can't think about healing communities if we're not being honest about what's actually causing the harm. And oftentimes what's causing the harm is the inequity. And what is the source of the inequity? It's that adverse community environment. And when you go to the next layer, it's looking at what's driving that and what was the intentionality to drive that. So creating the power in place is helping and working with community partners to have them define what is their priority, what is their experience. And we're talking about the narrative change. So you asked the question about change. What has been really most powerful is taking those voices with the evidence, marrying that with the public health work that we do, but also the policy analysis, and doing the narrative change, changing the stories that we've told ourselves to justify the inequities that we see. That's the first piece. So we do that with place-based coalitions, but we're also doing it within systems. So the other 14 sites that we have are local health departments, because we have to make the change from within, not just from outside. So that's working on both levels, and yes, we can chew gum and walk at the same time. And that means that we can work in community, but we can also work in systems. It's not an either or, it is definitely a both and, but it's being really intentional about thinking about those specific policy drivers that are creating that harm. And can we do this in red states? I'll show you. Look at our map. Yes, you can. Can you do this in blue states? Absolutely. Can you? Can you do it in purple states? Absolutely. It's creating that will from the ground up. And so that is the representation of the work that we do, and redefining resilience and not expecting people to bounce back with all of the burdens, but to say that true community resilience is looking at what can we do to put equitable access to the supports and buffers that, number one, prevent adversity from being experienced in the first place, making sure that folks have what they need to heal, but most importantly, do they have equitable access to the supports and buffers to bounce forward and thrive? And we're talking about our children and families. We're talking about our future. And so that is really the work that we do at the systems level in 20 different communities, working with community coalitions, working with public health partners, education. It's an all-in strategy. It's not just health and human services, because all of our systems ultimately serve our communities.
Thank you, Wendy, and so appreciate that you share the complexity of the work and the importance of centering it on families and equity. So really appreciate that. So Lotta, you started your position over a year ago, almost a year ago, but you come with a long history of working directly in communities as an anchor institution. Share with us what you've seen over the last couple of years and your day-to-day work more specifically.
Sure. Thanks, Marjorie. Well, it's hard to follow Wendy, so thank you for that moment for transition. But but actually to build on my sister here's introduction to the complexity of the landscape, but also the possibility of place. You don't necessarily think about your cultural institutions as the center there, right? When we talk about systems change and improving lives, we've been very conditioned to think about the most mechanical of human needs and outcomes, right? What kind of job are you gonna get? How many times do they go to the doctor? How much money are they making? What are the numbers around every human? Which are important. But it takes a lot of humanity out of existence. Like, what is a good life? You all are here. We're all here in this week because we know what a good life is. Because a good life is a meaningful life, is an enriched life. And museums are nothing if they are not the temples where we celebrate what humans do. And so there has been a movement really for the last 20 years to really start to shift the way and the position that cultural institutions play in their community. You know, when you think of a great place to live, it has libraries, it has theater, it has parks, they have museums, they have places to go to celebrate being human. So when we talk about those inequities of lived experiences, it's not just food deserts, where there are celebration deserts that have been intentionally designed to be celebration deserts. If you think about every one of you all, I hope, when Marjorie thought about a powerful place, I want you to think about the least invested in part of the place you live in. There is always one. There is a place, a part of your community that you know goes without. And what does that without look like? That without looks like a drought of places. So that's what we're really thinking about. And so in the last, particularly 2 years, this movement within the cultural community has really gained a lot of steam, because what happened, what we found out, particularly with the lens around children and families' health and support, is none of our systems showed up for families. Schools were thinking about the classroom. They weren't thinking about families. That was not the policy that was being made, to think about families. When we're thinking about other systems, they were thinking about the particular part of the human, the pieces of the family. So WIC was thinking about mothers and infants, but who was talking about toddlers? When we're talking about other social services, they pulled right back into their little corners and made families work harder to get the supports that are supposed to be available to them. And so who stepped up? In a lot of communities, your cultural institutions set up. Your libraries became places to get vaccine information, became the hub for information dissemination. Museums stood up and gave their spaces to be classrooms for the children whose parents didn't have the luxury to stay home. So we saw that across the country, and that has been building for decades. And so that's starting to change the way we think about places. So in the good times, we say we go to the grocery store for food. We go to the library for story time. We go to the museum because it makes us feel like we're investing in our children and in our families. But now we're transforming into services. And part of that work, is that momentum has actually been taken into a partnership that Wendy and I, we had our own, our beer summit in my backyard.
That's right.
So,
We had our
Mata,
first
before
summit.
you
We
go
did.
into the partnership,
Sure.
and we'd love to get into the
Yeah.
details of that partnership, I do want to, because you started to illuminate some, possibilities
Yeah.
and some strategies that, have surfaced
Sure.
as a result of the pandemic. But I want us to go back and think about, what are the barriers? Because we're going to
yeah.
leave you with some real solid solutions,
Yeah.
but we also want you to understand those systemic barriers
Yeah.
that prevent this work from moving forward. forward. So Lotta, if you wouldn't mind kind of giving your lens on what are the barriers that really don't honor, celebration in places or don't
Sure.
honor the power in these places. And then Wendy will turn to you immediately after.
Yeah, and so in the museum space, in the cultural space, we work a lot with the notion of self-esteem of our visitors, right, in humanity. We're really working in what's motivating people to pursue enrichment. That's how it brings people to museums. And so one of the outgrowths of the service mentality, particularly in the children's museum field, which is the best part of the museum field, in this case. But we were really looking at how do you support whole families, and especially those that are in the most need. And of course, socioeconomic status always comes up. And the leadership of that community identified an opportunity to bring this very diffuse network of museums, say, how can we tap into a systemic trigger, a lever, to really tap into reaching into the families we want to reach the most, and also provide good. And what we identified was the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, food stamps. It is one of the most undersubscribed social program. So there are anywhere between, I think the subscription rate is maybe over nationally, there are at least 30% of eligible families who don't sign up for SNAP when they could. A lot of that is around stigma, right? So when we think about self-esteem, there is a deep shame story in this country around getting help to be fed. And so we know that going to a museum, saying that you're a museum-going family, actually is a high social capital investment from families. And so we developed a program that's called Museums for All. The website is museums4all.org. I now am the funder of that program in my new position. But as the implementer, the important thing was it gave museums a systemic way. This was beyond free nights or free passes, which are one-off and not really systematic change making. How can we tap into this system? And so that program launched in 2014. We have nearly 1,000 museums across the country that do this. I'm not going to go into the details of what it is, but it's now really a national program. And here are some important things. We thought, is it going to matter that we're offering a standing discount, zero, free to up to $4 admission for SNAP recipients? We've exceeded 4 million visits.
Wow, that's amazing.
Even during the pandemic. And what's happened is that was all the benefit for museums and families and their beautiful testimonials about what it means to be able to access the high value experience of going to museums, particularly for parents, because it's expensive, not just in money, but in time, right, to go. So what it means to be able to do that and have that as a family experience. Now, a few years down the road, what we're seeing is that partnerships between local SNAP offices and their cultural institutions are making the jobs easier of our social service agencies. They're able to help clients over the stigma hump to receive those services and to have that support for their families, because they say, look, you get to come to museums anytime, anywhere across the country. That's here, and that's a benefit you get. That's a benefit and investment that you get for your family. And in some cities, they are seeing substantive increases in their enrollments and people staying current because they've built a positive relationship, There's some mitigation to the shame. So that's some of the things
I
that we're
really
looking
appreciate
at
that.
there.
I really appreciate that example because what you're doing is reducing stigma and you're leveraging both public resources, community resources, and anchor institutions that are really trusted.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. So Wendy, if you wouldn't mind sharing your lens on what are some of the barriers for doing the work that you're doing and where you're seeing some of the hope. Not specific examples, because we'll get into those, but where you're seeing just kind of like areas of probably practice and policy and hope.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, being community-based and also working similarly in systems, you're dealing with a different mixture of barriers. You're dealing with operational barriers because of rules, norms inside of organizations, but then you're also dealing with barriers with regard to what information community has actually been shared. And knowledge of what is actually available. So it is educating and also coaching, I think, as a mix of both of them. Specifically what have been some of the biggest barriers over the last 2 years has been this pushback on teaching our history. This so-called anti-CRT, which no one's teaching theory, we're talking about history. I teach theory as a professor, but I certainly don't do that in community. I'm talking about history, facts. So that's been a cultural barrier. The oppression of women and families. You spoke about the idea that we have this stigma around poverty, which then perhaps prevents people from accessing the resources that they're entitled to. And how we see our courts and our decisions coming down in such a way for the cruelty is the point. That's a huge barrier. With regard to disenfranchisement, the threat of the loss of the vote for individuals is a huge barrier. When you're talking about leveraging community power, the power of place, that couldn't be a bigger threat than anything if you can't exercise your right to vote and have representation. That's the other piece of it. Underutilization, we've already talked about that, of existing programs, and the allocation of resources, particularly by place, is a huge barrier. And then one of the things that I think, and this will bridge us to the hope, so those are the fear. I did get up this morning, so there is hope still. But, demonstrating, and I think this is something that those of us that we've not been programmed this way to think about it, but demonstrating both social and economic return. The reality is, we can't just do good to feel good. We have to actually show what we're doing is working, and it's moving towards, when we talk about moving towards economic mobility for families, for women, for communities, that needs to be measurable. And that's not going to be measurable because you taught people financial literacy. That's going to be measurable because people are actually moving on a trajectory. The other barriers that I just listed are out of their way. So when we talk about what are some of the things where we're having successes, what gives me hope is this working at community around advocacy. I was just in Cincinnati earlier this week, or last week, so no, yeah, this is Sunday, that working with the community agenda that came out of our truth and equity work that we partnered with in Cincinnati, a community-driven policy agenda, sitting down with council members and giving them something concrete that isn't about new programs, but leverage the programs that we have, allocate them and give them where they're needed, but also let's get the barriers out of the way. So I don't know how much you all know about Cincinnati, Ohio, but it's the home of a number of Fortune 500 companies, global brands, and yet it has the highest rate of infant mortality, one of the highest rates of infant mortality in the country, one of the highest rates of childhood poverty in the country. How can that be? Because this is America. That's how that can be. And so when we talk about all these wonderful pledges that have been made by corporations to address racial equity and economic equity, why not do that right in your home when you can look out of your penthouse conference room and you can see the change being made right there? So we are working with city council members on a very aggressive plan to create affordable housing. So, and it's one of many strategies, but one of them is small dollar mortgages. So creating a pathway for individuals to stay in place, to stabilize neighborhoods, but also a pathway to home ownership, to building them their way out of poverty. That's how we do this. This isn't just teaching one person. It's actually providing pathways for entire communities. And when we do this, this is part of this target universalism. This is also what's giving me hope, is that it does actually have bipartisan support. There are several pieces of legislation right now wending their way through that thing called Congress, that jungle, that actually we can demonstrate that, yes, it will work for communities of color and urban populations, but it also serves a very specific need in our rural communities. So this is equity, again, it's so important, and this is what gives me hope, is that part of this narrative change is we do come back to equity, racial equity in this country, and rightfully so because of our history. But there is a large swath of this population that has also been left behind intentionally, reliably, and predictably.
Every time.
And so if we don't answer those issues and actually help to talk that through and provide strategies for that, we're going to get nowhere. And so that's what's giving me hope, is that some of these unlikely suspects are actually coming to the table to support the things like the advocacy and listening to community and doing it at a place base. Congress is going to do what Congress is going to do, but the power of place is in our communities.
Really appreciate that, Wendy, and I hope all of you are feeling like you're in a graduate class on the power of place. And so I want to bring Lada's voice into this to share, kind of what she's seeing in some specific communities. And then I would like to move us into the partnership that you all have sparked. How did it happen? What are the outcomes? And what are the hopes and visions you have for that work? So, Lada, your kind of lens on a community.
My lens on a community. Okay. So, what I really want to talk about is Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. So, and going back to this notion of what does place mean, and what are the layers of places, and how do you use the places in the place you're in? Mm-hmm. So during the massive school shutdowns at the beginning of the pandemic, again, one of the crises that we didn't really name and acknowledge, and we're still not acknowledging, is that there were still children that needed places to go. There were children who needed places to go because number one, because they've always needed places to go before, and school was one of those places that might have been the most stable place in their lives. Second, we had children whose parents were making the world run, while probably most of us in this room were sitting at home and enabling us to do that and stay safe. And then third, we also have the largest minority in this country are people with disabilities, and they are the most invisible. They are the most disappeared in this country, and those children and families lost services completely and totally, pretty much across the country. So, Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. I'm sure you all know that it's one of our major urban metropolitan centers in the country. A small community in a very purple-ish state that was experiencing all of the complexities, all of the structural complexities of large cities across the country. And so we had been preaching to our constituents of children's museums, because what maybe you don't also know is that 90% of museums shut their doors for more than a year. And there's, more than 250,000 people who are employed at museums. So we had 200,000 people lose their jobs in the cultural sector. So we thought about how can we be of service, not only to be of service, but to also preserve livelihoods of the families that are part of our community. And so we invited our institutions to reach out to their school districts to be part of the local solution to our place problem when it comes to children. And so the Children's Museum of Fond du Lac reached out to one of their local school districts. And what happened, thinking about those communities that I was talking about, is that that school district has a charter school that serves children on the autism spectrum. And given the COVID regulations, they did not have one single district-owned facility that could accommodate these children and their educators during COVID. But an empty children's museum could. And it turns out it was cheaper to totally replace the digital infrastructure of the museum to provide distance learning than any of their existing school buildings. Turns out they had better care facilities in the Children's Museum. And so that Children's Museum became the charter school for 2 years. That Children's Museum is going to continue to be part of the charter school classroom after that pandemic, because what we also learned there is what it is to teach children in a child-centered environment, not an institutional environment. And so that's starting to change fundamentally the way a school district is thinking about the places that they offer children. What do their classrooms look like? What's the experience of every child in that school district? What does it mean? What could it be like? Educators got to be in a child-centered environment. And so now they're a child-centered community. There's a whole coalition that's building around this that includes pediatricians, that includes the libraries, that's including the hospitals. Because we could be, when we experience place, when we experience the places that are actually made for humans and human thriving, it makes us look at every place that we're in differently. So those are the kinds of things that are giving me hope.
That is such a great example of something that's happening in a place that is very powerful that needs national recognition, right? Think about your communities and what's happening there. This example is probably something that should be shared in your communities, right? Because children with disabilities, children on the autism spectrum are in every community, and how are they being served? So thank you for that very specific example. So let's turn to your partnership. How did it start? How was it funded? You're both Ascend Fellows, so make certain you weave that in. And who would like to go first?
Yeah, so how it started was in the, that time, March to May of 2020, that for all of us, we can remember where we were when the country went into lockdown. We can remember when we saw the first video of George Floyd, when we saw also, because remember, George Floyd happened the same week as the Amy Cooper incident in Central Park. So, you know, if you didn't think that racism was a thing, that the power of invoking some of the images, the tropes of this country's, our narrative was a thing, 2020 really slapped you in the face, right? And for me, a person who was working centered in equity, centered in community, but also more importantly, grounded in fact and truth, it was a very, you know, I was frustrated. Let's just put it that way. That's the most polite way of saying it. And my sister here and I were talking, and I said, the big problem that we have in this country is we don't even know our truth. We don't know our history. We don't know our facts. We're not taught it. It's to say it's whitewashed is actually to minimize the harm that has been done by not telling our truths. And, you know, I'm working in community, and when I was talking about redlining like 5 years ago, I had so many people say, I had no idea. Like, how could you not know that? But I realized that as a person of color, I have the benefit, or perhaps I don't have the benefit, of not knowing the truth. Because you learn the truth at the knees of your grandparents. You hear the stories. And so it is something that is our informal education, but it certainly forms how we walk through this world. And certainly Lauda, being a person of Latino heritage, has her own story of the American experience, that oftentimes there's a different narrative that goes with that. And so we were just like, how do we get this truth? How do we get these stories out there in a way that's moving, not just making people bleed, but like revealing the truth so we can act upon it?
Yep. So, so she brought me this light topic. And,
I brought
and
beer or wine.
no, it was, bourbon.
Bourbon, that's right. 'Cause
No, that's,
everything goes
that's,
better with bourbon.
that's where we were. And so, again, there has been this movement about what's the role of museums as storytellers. They are literally the receptacles of facts. Think about your, your local historical organizations, your art museums, et cetera. I said, you know what? You know who holds a lot of those stories, but they don't tend to be on the wall? Our museums. So we have some that are ready and that are doing this work too, that are undisappearing the assets that have been held in cases and in the back that they know they have, but are not part of the public education that they are charged with. And so we were talking about Wendy's network and the cities where this was happening, and she started to talk about her hometown in Cincinnati and sharing with me the historical role of Cincinnati on the road to freedom. You know, the Underground Railroad Freedom Center is there. And so we talked about it, and I said, oh, you know, I've actually been working with the Cincinnati Museum Center. They're ready for this. So what if we put our communities together? What if I was able to bring museums to a public health coalition?
And so one of the things that came out of this was, you know, I said, okay, I put on my research. So there's the community activist hat, there's the angry policy writer, and there's then there's the professor piece of me. And I said, okay, so really what this country needs is its own process of truth and reconciliation, because we have not faced our truths in a systematic way. But, you know, to get anything going in Washington, D.C. is like, that's just screaming into the void. What is important is to do it at the community level, because we have to make this real in place.
Yeah.
And so, you know, part of Cincinnati, as Lauda said, was it was a very important stop on the Underground Railroad. It's one of the first pieces of land of actual free territory. But it was also this commingling of, you know, you had bounty hunters there that were capturing not only people who were freedom seekers, but also those who held their papers. Ohio was one of the first states that actually enacted black codes, which were the blueprint for the Jim Crow laws. And so, you know, you think like, well, they're free. It was a free state. They didn't hold slaves, but yet they were right there on the border. And so that being able to tell that story and understand how those things that happened, those events from 200 years ago, really do inform what we see as a community today. The patterns of concentrated poverty, the high segregation there. But while those stories were unique to Cincinnati, they're also generalizable to this country, to almost any part of the country. So partnering with the museum, we were able to use so much of the archives there with the community coalition. And I said, you know, truth and reconciliation is great if all we wanted to do is healing. But my eye has always been on systems change.
Yeah.
And so we observe that reconciliation will happen, but I think we need to talk about what this really is and what this is doing. And so we renamed it Truth and Equity. Because truth is what we're using to help mobilize to get towards equity. And equity is the piece that is the absolute systems change of it. So we mobilized that group.
We did, and what I want to mention also as part of that opportunity was what brought us together was our relationship that we have through our fellowship, and then there was other opportunity because our experience was disrupted. our program gave us the opportunity to pursue some small funding to advance some of our ideas. And so that was another asset that was brought to my backyard that day that we were working through our ideas. Is this an idea that we could have a little bit of money? And I think that's important that it was, we think about these big ideas that we think, well, that's got to be $25 million. And
Although
it
I
was
would
not.
take it.
Yeah, 100%. But to Wendy's point about leveraging what's already in place, how you bring two things together with a little bit of important money,
Thank you, Ascend.
Yeah.
a little bit of really important money to help us also overcome the barriers of our partners on the ground, to recognize their efforts to bring this forward and lead to policy change, but also some concrete assets.
Yeah, concrete assets. And so, the concrete assets, number one was, and what is most important to me as far as the community is concerned, is that policy and advocacy agenda. And actually sitting down with lawmakers to say, these are the things that need to be done. But what was also, and I would be remiss not to talk about the legacy of this work, is the film that I produced. So I created a film, Truth and Equity, it's called America's Truth, Cincinnati. And it really does help us to understand how Cincinnati got to where it was. And it peels back the layers of how policy intersected and impacted these 4 Black communities there. So you look at housing, law enforcement, public education, economic development. Each one had a synergistic role in creating the outcomes that we see today. And so it really does this examination over 100 years of history to help us understand that we did not get here because of bad people. We got here intentionally, because policy was enacted in a way to create these outcomes at the community level. And so that is
And the museum had the facts.
The museum had the receipts.
We had the receipts, the literal receipts.
Fellows, we are coming towards the end of our time. Thank you so much for sharing that specific collaboration, the results of it, and the origins of it. Really appreciate it. We have a few minutes for question and answers from the audience. So we have some mic runners. If you have a question of me or of Wendy or Lotta. Over here. I believe we need a mic. Thank you.
Does it work?
Morning.
Thank you so much. It was really lovely. So I'm trying to ask my question in the nicest way.
Sure. You don't have to ask
You
it
don't have
nicely,
to
just
know
ask your
filter,
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my name is Mohammed Faisal. I'm from Khartoum, Sudan. So I'm trying to understand the global perspective here. So I see the continuous violations the U.S. government make on outside its borders. Like, it's one thing I want to understand, like, are Americans worth more than other countries? Because we constantly see these violations that the U.S. government make on your behalf. And as a Sudanese citizen, I see, okay, you're the taxpayer, so the government is representing you. So I want to know, because like when you ask the question of place of power, I constantly thought of the U.S. and its hegemony on all over the world. So I need to understand like more of the global perspective on the power that America has on worldwide.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question, because my other hat is assistant professor in the global health department. So I actually teach structural racism as the global implications for public health. And so understanding at the end of the day, what we're describing here is an artifact of colonialism. And that what you're describing with regard to disempowerment in place across the globe, whether it was the US, whether it was Germany, Belgium, or many other countries that practice in colonialism, again, the disparities that you see on various continents, particularly for communities of color, really trace their roots back to colonialism.
Yeah.
And so understanding that, but that's the part of our history that is so, theoretical, but yet it's very much factual, is important. But to get to your specificity on the question of how the U.S. government represents the people. That's such a wonderful notion. But I think that we know, particularly, I mean, you know, the J6 hearings really let us understand the fragility of democracy, that it is a republic, but that's the theory. In practice, it has always been representative of a very small few. And so I don't think that most Americans understood how fragile the power is in our country as far as being a representative democracy. But, you know, unfortunately, what has been broadcast, and this is why narrative change is so important, what's been broadcast across the globe is that when our troops are in Sudan, or when our troops are in Afghanistan, or when our peacekeepers go here, that's representative of the American people. And we know that most of the American people don't even know what's happening in the next state, let alone the intricacies of foreign policy. So it is not representative, but unfortunately, you know, as a Sudanese, all you know is this is America. So this must be how Americans really feel, and that's just not the case.
Thank you for the question and for the response, Wendy. Really appreciate it. We have time for one more question. Yes, thank you.
Hi. This is
Hi.
Oh, hi.
I think it's
Thank you
on.
very much for everything that you're doing. I guess the question that I have is, what are other barriers that you have found in your experience? I'm Mexican. I live here.
Hola. ¿Qué tal?
And one of the things that I had found here, trying to support the Latin community here and living in the U.S., is like one of the barriers can be the language.
Sure.
And other barrier can be trust, especially trust when you're an outsider coming to live a better life, and
Yep.
sometimes the country cannot deliver on that promise. And so, what are other barriers, and how can we overcome those barriers? And probably, what are other cultural institutions that we can engage with in order to facilitate this change for these other populations?
That's a great question. We're running out of time, so I'm going to take that question and pivot it just a bit and ask, in closing, both Lada and Wendy to close on what is your best recommendation for how to enter into place and recognize the power of that place?
I'm going to answer your question with that. I come from the cultural sphere, which is about telling the stories of how we work as a group and a society. And I think our greatest opportunity is to move away from the American story of individualism to the story of relationship and community. Because these decisions that we make are ones that honor individual benefit and dishonor relationship. And I think when we can embrace a culture that is about relationship in all of our places in these disparities, it can open our eyes to better choices and more opportunities.
Yeah, so how do we get to the relationship piece? And that's humility. You know, we all are sitting here in a very privileged space here. Not everyone that we work with can be here. And we all probably have titles and accomplishments, but none of that matters when I'm sitting across the table from my partners in community. I might be a black woman. Well, no, I am a black woman. Let's be clear. I am. I'm certain in my identity. But that doesn't mean I know every black woman's story. I'm an American, but I don't know every American story. I can read about it, but that doesn't mean I've lived it. And so I think that is the most important thing if you're talking about building trust, which I'm so glad you brought that up, and being effective in the relationship building. Well, the relationship's going to go at the speed of trust, and the speed of trust means that you are willing to be humble, and you're willing to be vulnerable, and that's so hard. That is so hard for us to do. But I will tell you that in the 20 different communities that I work in, each one of those partners, we are hugging. We are friends. We are comrades. We are in it for the right reasons, and we see each other. And so you can't be doing this work at the community level if folks can't see you because they won't hear you. And vice versa. And so I would say, the humility that we should walk with in all of our relationships to build towards change that is the number one ingredient. That's the first ingredient of the recipe.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and what a wonderful note to end on. And please know that you can join us again tomorrow for an Ascend conversation, 9 o'clock here, The Power of Parents, Transforming Communities with Families at the Center. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's our pleasure.
Jenny,